Hello students, welcome back to the Endocrine System, Chapter 11, Part 3. Today we're going to look at the pituitary gland, sometimes called the master gland. Now, you've seen these pictures before. Here is the superior view of the skull, and there's the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, temporal bones, and up here would be the parietal bones. Okay, and then the occipital. Now, in the sphenoid bone, you had this depression. We're looking down on this depression where the bone actually comes up here, dips, and then comes back up to make this depression. Here it is from the sagittal view. That depression of the bone, of that sphenoid bone, is called the sella turcica, and it actually forms a protective groove that holds that pituitary gland. There's the cerebrum, the corpus callosum, the area of the third ventricle, and the thalamus gives rise to the hypothalamus as you come down. And then the stalk that holds the pituitary gland is called the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus will, here it is again, the third ventricle, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, infundibulum is the stalk, the pituitary stalk, and the hypothalamus here. The pituitary gland is divided into the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. A lot of people will say that these are like two different glands. They work in different ways, so they are considered two different lobes of the same gland. Some people consider them as two different glands. Okay, so the anterior lobe. So anterior means that here's the nose over here and here's the back of the head. So anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And then you have the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now this is a graphic that I've found that from juniordentist.com, and I have this on Blackboard, and then it is a link that to a website that will help you review on the endocrine system. But I thought this was pretty cool because now here is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and here's the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now that means that the nose would be over here and the back of the head over here. So anyway, so this is a neat graphic in that it shows you what the function of the anterior pituitary gland is and what it releases and its target cells, and then the function and what it releases and the target cells of the posterior pituitary. These represent vessels, blood vessels, veins. Look how vascular these small structures are, because these hormones are released through are into the blood, going to that to the either the endocrine gland or to the tissue with the target cells somewhere else in the body. But hormones are carried by the blood and regulated by the blood levels, the levels of the chemicals or hormones in the blood. And other substances all regulate the release or the lack of release of hormones into the bloodstream. So blood levels will determine whether or not a hormone is released. And you can, okay, so let's talk first about the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases either releasing hormones or release inhibiting hormones. So this represents a blood vessels in the hypothalamus where a hormone is released from the hypothalamus and then carried by blood vessels down to the anterior pituitary. Now, the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus are going to dictate what hormones are going to be released from the anterior pituitary. So here's an example. This thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, which you don't have to remember this one, but you do need to remember this one. This thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is picked up, this hormone's picked up by the bloodstream and taken to the anterior pituitary. And since this is a releasing hormone, it stimulates the anterior pituitary into releasing thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, where the target cells, the thyroid. We'll be talking more about that in just a minute. Okay, then the hypothalamus can release releasing factor hormones or release inhibiting hormones. In this case, it's whether or not the anterior pituitary will release the hormone prolactin. The hormones of the hypothalamus that are released, picked up by the bloodstream, or the hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, picked up by the bloodstream, taken to the anterior pituitary. If prolactin releasing factor is released from the hypothalamus, picked up, taken to the anterior pituitary, then prolactin will be released and the target cells are in the mammary glands, and so milk production will be promoted, or the stimulation of the cells to produce milk would happen. Now also, the hypothalamus could release a hormone that is a inhibiting hormone. So it works just the opposite. This prolactin release inhibiting hormone is picked up by the bloodstream, produced in the hypothalamus, picked up by the bloodstream, taken to the anterior pituitary. These are tiny, tiny blood vessels that go directly to the anterior pituitary. And if this prolactin release inhibiting hormone is in this blood and it goes to the anterior pituitary, well, guess what? The prolactin isn't released. Now, sometimes both hormones can be produced, but if there's more prolactin releasing factor than there is prolactin release inhibiting hormone, more releasing, then some of the prolactin will be produced by the anterior pituitary to go to the target cells in the mammary glands. Okay, and it's like we talked about neurotransmitters before, where you can have excitatory or inhibitory, and sometimes both are released, but it is the amount or the level that is released that will determine which way that reaction will go, and it's the same thing here. Okay, and then this just represents the target cells that the anterior pituitary will reach. Let's talk about more of those. Okay, the control for the anterior pituitary gland is by the hypothalamus, and again, this is just a little different graphic, where the hormone that is released by the hypothalamus can be for stimulation, or it can be for inhibition, or not to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce a hormone for the target cell, either a peripheral endocrine gland or directly to other target cells, and again carried by the bloodstream. So if it's inhibiting, then the anterior pituitary will not release a hormone to the peripheral endocrine gland or to the directly to the target cells. If it is a stimulating, then it will, all carried by the bloodstream. Again, a special blood supply carries the hormones directly to the anterior pituitary gland from the hypothalamus, and we can see this here. There's the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, there's the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is influenced by hormones produced in the hypothalamus that are picked up by the blood. Okay, see these, this is vascular, this capillary bed. Capillaries, remember you have arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins. And so here there is an arteriole that comes in here to capillaries, and then from capillaries to venules, and so these veins pick up the hormone produced by the secretory. It secretes these hormones from the anterior pituitary glands. As those hormones are secreted, it is picked up by these paper-thin walls of these vanules, capillaries and vanules, to be carried to the target cells, either to another gland and then that gland will secrete a hormone, another hormone that will go to the target cells, or this hormone is taken directly to the target cells for a reaction. Okay, so the way the anterior pituitary gland works is by stimulation hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, in the hypothalamus. Okay. What glands are produced in the anterior pituitary gland? Growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormones, and luteinizing hormone. Now, in the anterior pituitary, there are 5 different types of epithelial cells. Now, we talked about a little bit about tissues, and epithelial cells are what make up your skin. But epithelial cells are also found in glands. And there are 5 different types of epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary gland. And each type, there are 4 types that produce a specific type of hormone. And growth hormone is produced by one type of epithelial cell in the anterior pituitary. Prolactin is produced by another type of epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, produced by a third type, and adrenocorticotropic hormone by a 4th type, and then a 5th type produces these 2 hormones. Okay? Now let's talk about growth hormones. What does a growth hormone do? Well, it does exactly what it says. It stimulates cells to grow. It promotes the growth of long bones. So before the age of 25, the long bones in the body, in the skeleton, are growing. We've talked about that before. The epiphyseal plate growth plate in that bone will cause the lengthening of that bone. Growth hormone stimulates the production of new cells and for the lengthening of those long bones in the epiphyseal plate. Also, it will stimulate the growth of new cells and the growth of or the production of new proteins. Now, when you're young, before the age of 25, a lot of growth hormone is produced so that you can have the lengthening of long bones and the growth of new tissue and such. But as you get older, you still produce a little bit of growth hormone. You don't have the lengthening of the bones, but you do have to have repairing of tissues and protein production. And so you need growth hormones for this to happen. Now, what happens with growth hormones, ups and downs, giantism? is the hyper secretion, hyper, too much, okay, more secretion of growth hormone in children. Acromegaly is the hyper secretion of growth hormones in adults. Dwarfism is the hyposecretion of growth hormone in children. Now, if a child is not growing, that's why usually a child is taken to a pediatrician. The pediatrician during their childhood, hopefully having checkups, and they'll check their weight and their height and compare it to other children. And if they are not growing like they should, then there can be some additional medication added to the child's regimen, a growth hormone, and this may take care of the problem, but sometimes this can be a genetic factor, and the hyposecretion of growth hormone, even with the addition of a growth hormone from a prescription, the supplemental growth hormone, then it may take care of the problem, or it may not. Another anterior pituitary hormone is prolactin. It sustains milk production after birth. Prolactin also, well, that's the main thing. Its target cells, since it sustains milk production after birth, its target cells would be in the breast, the mammary glands. Thyroid stimulation hormone, of course the target cells would be in the thyroid. It secretes the hormones. It helps to stimulate the thyroid to produce hormones. Thyroid, couple of different hormones here that we'll talk about shortly. But the thyroid stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, and the target cells are in the thyroid. Now the thyroid's going to produce its own hormones, and so the target cells would be in another location. But thyroid stimulating hormones target cells would be in the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, it controls the secretion of some hormones in the adrenal cortex. Now the adrenal cortex is the outermost layer of cells of the adrenal gland. Where's the adrenal gland? The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys. And so the outer layer of the cells are affected by the adrenocorticotropic hormones, and so the target cells would be in the adrenal cortex, the outermost layer of cells in the adrenal gland of the kidneys. So the target cells in the adrenal gland of the kidneys, the outer layer of cells for adrenocorticotropic hormones. Now that adrenal cortex will produce another set of hormones, and we will talk about those. The outer layer of the adrenal glands, they are specific to these target cells, and then it causes the adrenal cortex to release its own hormones. Follicle stimulating hormones, or FSH. In females, it stimulates the production of eggs in the ovaries. And in males, it stimulates the production of sperm cells, so they're sex hormones. Luteinizing hormones are supplemental to the follicle stimulating hormones. LH, it stimulates the release of the egg from the ovary during ovulation. So follicle stimulating hormones target cells are in the ovaries and causes the ovary to promote the developing or the maturing of the ovum or the eggs in the ovary, and luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of that mature egg from the ovary during ovulation. Okay, the posterior pituitary. Now, we looked at this picture before. Here we have the infundibulum, the stalk that leads to the pituitary, the hypothalamus. Now, the posterior pituitary is different from the anterior pituitary. Here is the posterior pituitary. Now, it has fewer blood vessels here. What you have is neurosecretory cells that secrete posterior pituitary hormones. Now what happens is that you have nervous stimulation. Now the anterior pituitary received a hormone from the hypothalamus, and that stimulated a hormone production by the anterior pituitary. Now neurosecretory cells causes these are like nerve fibers that the synaptic area is down here in the posterior pituitary. So the secretory cells are at the end of axons. Remember, okay, see, these would be the soma, or the cell body. Here's the axon, and then the axon terminal, or the synaptic knobs of these neurons. So the posterior pituitary acts from nervous stimulation from the hypothalamus. So the nerve fibers run from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary. And through this nerve impulse here, it causes the release of the hormones from the posterior pituitary, and the hormones are released, picked up by these blood vessels, and again, hormones are carried by the blood to another gland, target cells in another gland, or directly to the tissue, target cells in tissues. Capillaries carry away the hormones from the posterior lobe. And again, the posterior pituitary acts because it releases its hormone after nervous stimulation. What hormones are produced by the posterior pituitary? Antidiuretic hormones causes the kidney to conserve fluid. Now, a diuretic causes the kidneys to release fluids. Okay, in the summertime, you know that you're supposed to drink plenty of fluids to stay hydrated so you don't get dehydrated and have problems with overheating, and you've heard this many times. Okay, so you should drink a lot of water in the summertime when you're hot and when you're working to stay hydrated. If you love the taste of Coca-Cola or coffee, these are actually diuretics. They cause your kidneys to release fluid. So would that be a good drink for the summertime while you're working, though it tastes pretty good and that's what you like to drink and all? You do not need to be drinking the soda pop and the coffee, because they act as diuretics, releasing fluids. And so you're going to urinate a lot more, and you're going to be giving up fluids that your body needs. Antidiuretic hormone causes the kidneys to conserve the fluid so that you're not losing the fluids that you need. Okay, so less urine production. Antidiuretic hormone decreases the water released by the kidneys. So where would its target cells be? In the kidney. So the posterior pituitary produces antidiuretic hormone, ADH, directly goes by the bloodstream to the kidneys, and the kidneys are going to have specific cells, target cells, that will react from the presence of that antidiuretic hormone, against, will not allow the release of that fluid. It will conserve fluid. Okay? So it's picked up by the bloodstream, carried to the kidney, so the target cells are in the kidney. Another posterior pituitary hormone, oxytocin. Now, you might have heard this if you have been around pregnant women who are trying to give birth or after birth. The drug oxytocin could be given to the expecting mother when they're trying to promote contractions and promote the delivery of that baby. And then after the birth of the baby, oxytocin is given for uterine contraction to give up the afterbirth, and also to try to stimulate that uterus more so it can shrink and go back. That helps it to go back to its normal size. So oxytocin is given to induce labor, and then after birth it is given to help to deliver the afterbirth and reduce the size of the uterus. Oxytocin, along with prolactin, helps to stimulate the mammary glands to release its milk. Prolactin to produce the milk, and oxytocin helps in the release of the milk. Okay, we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with the thyroid gland the next time around.